Yeah, we back. Yeah, we back. Now, today I want to touch on a unique topic, right? Now, disclaimer, right? When I touch on this topic, this is not to promote any division. This is not to minimize the contributions of those from other parts of the country. This is not that. This is simply the historical reality of the matter. So I don't want anybody catching feelings. And I just want to say, me, myself, I'm not even from the North. So I'm not speaking with any bias. I'm speaking from just historical facts. But in today's video, I want to touch on the topic of when you examine the history, you notice that the overwhelming majority of legendary figures, specifically as it relates to Haitian history, you notice that the vast majority of them came from the North, right? Why did so many of our legendary ancestors come from the North? What was it about the North that produced so much greatness that even today, it still cannot be replicated? So today we're going to be talking about that. Now, just to kind of give you an overview of what I mean, right? We're going to go over some significant individuals who came from the northern section of Haiti, right? Off the top, the legendary, the biggest, right? Dessalines, right? When it comes to Dessalines, it's self-explanatory. He doesn't need an introduction. We already know what time it is. Not only was the North the launch pad for the revolution, but also the North was when the final victorious battle against the French was held, right? That was where the final battle, the victorious battle against the French, where they were driven out the island, where they surrendered, where they, got on one knee in front of Dessalines and said, yo, we surrender, it's over, we give up the colony, right? And we going back to our country. That all happened in the North. Dessalines' headquarters was in the North. Dessalines got married in the North. He raised his kids in the North. He grew up in the North, right? So, he a northern boy, right? So we already know what time it is with Dessalines. The next legendary figure that was produced in the North was Sanit Belair, right? Legendary female ancestor. She was actually the wife of Toussaint Louverture's nephew, right? So basically, she was Toussaint Louverture's niece-in-law. And she was known for fighting courageously alongside her husband, right? Side by side, riding on horseback with her husband, riding against the European colonists, killing the Frenchmen, right? And the vast majority of the military operations that she participated in were carried out in the North. And not only was she remembered in history for fighting bravely alongside her husband, but also when she was captured by the French military alongside her husband, she was actually killed by the French military. She was killed in the North, right? She died in the North. And believe it or not, when she died, right, when she was killed by the French military, she was only 21 years old. 21 years old. Now, let's continue. The next legendary figure produced in the North was, you already know, Toussaint Louverture. Just like Dessalines, he doesn't need any introduction. We already know what time it is. One of the greatest political minds, one of the greatest political strategists the black race ever produced, Toussaint Louverture, born and raised in the North, right? Born and raised in the North. Now, the next legendary figure produced in the North was Jean-Baptiste Belley, right? The first black man ever to be elected to a legislative body in Europe, right? Representing the colony of Saint-Domingue in the French National Convention, right? I believe he was born in Senegal, but, transported to the colony, and he was originally enslaved in the colony in the North, right? But eventually becoming a free man, getting his freedom, and then rising to, high political office in Europe, representing the colony in the French National Convention, advocating for the abolition of slavery. One of the most prominent free black men in the Western world. Now, let's continue. The next legendary figure produced in the North, you already know, none other than the king of the North himself, Christophe, King Henry Christophe, the king of the North, the king of Northern Haiti, crowned himself the king of the North, right? Yes, Christophe, northern boy, raised in the North, raised his family in the North, his wife, born and raised in the North, raised his kids, built a palace in the North, built a legendary citadel in the North, right? Established the Kingdom of Haiti in the North. I mean, the list goes on, man. A true Northern boy, a true up North representative. Now, we know Christophe was originally born in the British colonies, right? Some sources say St. Kitts, some sources say Grenada, but we know that he was not originally born in the colony of Saint-Domingue, right? Present-day Haiti. He was not born there, right? But he came there at a very young age, and the vast majority of his early years, his teenage years, his young adult years, and basically his entire life was mainly concentrated in the north of Haiti. That's where he established his government. That was where he had his military headquarters. That was where he met his wife. That's where he was married. That's where his kids were born. That's where he built his palace, his residence. That's where he built the legendary citadel that we know is one of the greatest constructions ever built by the black man in the history of civilization. And of course, at the time that the citadel was being constructed, of course, it shocked the world, right? You got this massive mountaintop fortress sitting on top of a mountain, 3,000 feet, in the sky, right? Equipped with hundreds of cannons on all sides, tucked away deep in the mountains in the north, right? The walls over 100 feet high and 30 feet thick, and also equipped with enough food, water, and ammunition to sustain over 5,000 soldiers in the worst case scenario of a French invasion. And also, as you can see, the citadel was obviously built with earthquake resistant technology, because ever since it was built over 200 years ago, Haiti has suffered multiple massive earthquakes, like earth-shattering earthquakes, right? Back in like the 1840s, it was like this disastrous earthquake that destroyed the north. It was like thousands of people that died, were crushed under the buildings that collapsed, right? But the citadel did not move. And there have been multiple earthquakes, hard-hitting earthquakes that have hit the country ever since then. And we already know back in 2010, that crazy earthquake where hundreds of thousands of people died. But even still then, the citadel did not move. The citadel was earthquake resistant. I don't even know how they built that joint. I swear to God, I don't know. But as you can see, the Haitians from the north, they was on another level back then. Now, if you want to learn more about Christophe, go to my playlist section. I have a playlist entitled The Biography of King Henry Christophe, where you can learn about the life of the legendary ancestor himself, right? You already know during his time when Christophe was in power, the Kingdom of Haiti, his territory, undisputed, no debate, that was when the country had reached the height of its prosperity, the height of its economic power, the height of its military power, the height of its economic self-sufficiency. All of these accomplishments came under the regime of Christophe. When Christophe was in power, the northern section of Haiti was essentially the headquarters of Black power. In terms of the Western Hemisphere, surrounded by the European colonies, the northern section of Haiti, when Christophe was the king, that was the headquarters of Black power. That was the headquarters of Pan-Africanism, right? Any black man from any part of the world could come down to the Kingdom of Haiti and you'll be welcomed in as a brother. Now, of course, during this time, the country was split into two governments, right? And the mulatto generals controlled the South. Now, the same rules applied for the South, too. If you're a black man, you could go to the south of Haiti and be welcomed in as a brother as well. But when it came to, the reins of power, that was held firm in the hands of the mulatto generals, right? They were the ones that held dominion. They were the ones that composed the majority of the elites. But when it came to the north of Haiti, if you're a black man, you could be raised to the status of an elite, right? Christophe would welcome you in as a brother. And the best example of this was Prince Saunders, a black man from the East Coast of the United States, right? A professor, an educator, somebody who already was, prominent in the United States. He came down to the Kingdom of Haiti and was very integral in establishing the first universities in the country, right? Established some of the first schools in the country. And he was part of the ruling class, right? He was welcomed in and eventually became part of the government, right? So as you can see, the northern section of Haiti, very integral to our history as black men. Now, moving on, the next historical figure produced from the north was Baron de Vastey, also known as Vastey the Baron, right? One of my favorite forefathers, right? The author of that legendary book that we read on my channel, The Colonial System Unveiled. Now, Vastey, as a teenager, he served under Toussaint Louverture. Then he served in the government of Dessalines. Then after Dessalines died, he served under Christophe as his secretary. When it came to Vastey, he was the international defender of the kingdom. He was the ideological defender of the kingdom, right? He was the author of all the books that were published by the government. He worked side by side with Christophe for several years until the day he died, right? Shaping the policy of the government, serving as an advisor to the king. And also, like I said, he was the one that put out that legendary book, The Colonial System Unveiled. And in that book, The Colonial System Unveiled, I read that on my channel. Go to my playlist section, right? Vastey gave firsthand testimony from interviews that he conducted with those that suffered under the yoke of European colonialism, not only during slavery, but also the crimes against humanity carried out by the French military during the Revolution. And that book came out back in 1814, and we read that right here on my channel, right? And the significance of that book was, you got to imagine back in that time in the early 1800s, in a world that was dominated by European colonial narratives, this book was a book written by black men from the perspective of black men that was published in our publishing houses, right? Black men finally had our own printing presses so we could finally put out our own books from our perspectives, unhindered and uncensored. And it was more than just a book. This book was a historical indictment, right? It was firsthand testimony, interviews conducted with those who described the atrocities they lived through or their family members lived through, or they might have, talked about how their family member got killed by the French colonists, right? An uncensored description of the atrocities, the crimes against humanity, the tortures, the sexual assaults, the genocide carried out by the French against our people, right? And this was an expose. And it shook up the world at the time, because you got to understand, the Europeans justified the crimes against humanity by saying that we are bringing civilization. So once all these crimes were exposed in front of the world, and not only that, but they actually named names, right? When Vastey wrote this book, he named names. He called the colonists out, right? This person did this. Mr. Galifet did this. Mr. Jean-Baptiste did this. Mr. Delma did this, right? He exposed the French colonists, and these were prominent individuals in Europe, and he exposed their crimes in front of the entire world, right? So this book was a crazy controversial book at the time. So, Vastey was the one that wrote that book, man. And that book was published in our printing presses in the North. Yes, in the North. Once again, in the North. As you can see, the North holds a very high cultural significance. Now, let's continue. The next historical figure produced in the North is General Francois Capois, right? A very notable general during the Revolution, led many legendary engagements against the French during the Revolution, both on land and on sea, right? At one time, he led an attack against the French in a makeshift canoe, right? On the boats, right? Another time, the final battle of the Revolution, the Battle of Vertières, the final victorious battle. He was on the front line, right? And they said, man, his hat got shot with a bullet from the French. His hat flew off his head, right? And then his horse that he was riding got shot and killed by the French. So he hopped off the horse and he was running towards the French, running into a hail of bullets on foot, charging against the French, right? So like I said, man, legendary general, legendary ancestor. Rest in peace, Francois Capois. The next legendary historical figure produced in the North was General Georges Biassou, right? I believe he was born and raised in the North, but he actually died in the United States. He actually died in Florida, right? And I believe that his house is actually like a legendary historical cultural center down in Florida. I think down in St. Augustine, Florida, if I'm not mistaken, right? Take a look up on the screen. I think it's called the Salcedo House. Here on this site in 42nd Street, George Street, stood the home of the nation's first black general, George Biassou, who came to St. Augustine, Florida from his native Saint-Domingue, today the nation of Haiti, in 1796 as an officer of the Spanish militia. General Biassou was one of the original leaders of the 1791 slave uprising in Haiti. For his service to the Spanish against the French, he became a Spanish general and came to St. Augustine, Florida with an entourage and staff of 27 fellow revolutionaries as Florida's second highest paid official. Although living at this home here in the center of the city, Biassou owned a large tract of land north of the town. In St. Augustine, Biassou was placed in command of the Free Black Militia that guarded the southern approach to the city of Fort Matanzas. Today, Fort Matanzas is a national monument and part of the National Park Service. General Biassou died in 1801 and was buried in Tolomado Cemetery on Cordova Street following his funeral held in St. Augustine Catholic Church Basilica. Right, so as you can see, General George Biassou, very prominent black man down in Florida in the early 1800s, the late 1790s. Now, let's continue. The next legendary figure produced in the North, right, is Anténor Firmin. Now, about 2 weeks ago, I dropped a video where I spoke about Anténor Firmin. The video was entitled, "Why Did the German Navy Attack Haiti Back in 1902? The Anténor Firmin Rebellion." And I had basically talked about how the United States and Germany collaborated to sabotage Anténor Firmin from becoming the president of the country. Go check out that video, a very classic piece of content. Now, Anténor Firmin, legendary black man, born and raised in the North, right? Diplomat, lawyer, Minister of Foreign Affairs, anthropologist, Minister of Commerce, as well as the author of some legendary books, right? He wrote the legendary book, The Equality of the Human Races, right? Which was a response to a book written by a French white supremacist by the name of Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, who had basically was talking about, the so-called superiority of the European Aryan race. So Anténor Firmin put out his own book in response entitled The Equality of the Human Races, right? Basically challenging the ideas of European race science that was very, prominent during that time in the late 1800s. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the ideas that guys like Hitler was coming with, the so-called superiority of the European Aryan race, those ideas originally came from guys like Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, right? A white supremacist from France, and other guys like that were promoting those type of ideas in the atmosphere. And Anténor Firmin, he was pushing back against that. Not only pushing back against that, but also asserting the equality of the black race as well. And not only was he a fierce defender of our people, and keep in mind, he also was one of the organizers of the first ever Pan-African Conference back in London in the year 1900. He was also famous for the fact that when the United States wanted to establish a naval base in the country back in the late 1800s, when he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he outright rejected the idea, outright rejected the Americans, said, ain't no way you establishing a naval base on this country. That is against the Constitution. You are a foreign power. Go back to your country. I believe that incident took place back in the year 1891. So you could imagine When Firmin ran for president later on in the year 1902, then you already know why the United States, as well as other European powers, collaborated to make sure he did not reach the destination of power. Now, let's continue. The next historical figure produced in the North was Charlemagne Péralte, born and raised in the North, right, from a very prominent family, a very elite family. When the United States invaded the country in 1915, he was the one that led the rebellion against the Americans, led the rebellion against the U.S. Marines when they invaded the country. And unfortunately, he was killed in the year 1918. I believe he was killed by the U.S. Marines. And afterwards, they displayed his dead body in the public, basically to discourage the rest of the population from taking up arms against the invading force. Right, from taking up arms against the Americans. They displayed Charlemagne's dead body in front of everybody, basically saying, look at your leader, right? This your leader. Look what we did to him. We killed him. Look at his dead body. Look at him decomposing in the street like an animal. That's what the U.S. Marines did to Charlemagne Péralte after they killed him. But during the years of combat, when he was fighting against the Americans, I believe from 1915 to 1918, the Americans, they was having a hard time, man. That's why they had to reinforce the Marines with air support. Right, the tide began to shift in favor of the Marines once they added warplanes into the combat. Right, because when it was just toe-to-toe guerrilla warfare, it was a tough battle because we understood our terrain, we understood our country, we knew our territory. So they didn't know how to really engage with us because they weren't familiar with the territory. But once they added the helicopters into the mix, that was when the tide began to shift into their favor. They had to reinforce the Marines with helicopters against the forces of Charlemagne Péralte. But unfortunately, eventually they got him and killed him, and the rebellion was put down. But once again, another legendary figure produced in the north of Haiti, right? I don't know what it is, man. It's something about the North, man, the revolutionary spirit in the North. But let's talk about what was the reason why did the North of Haiti become such fertile ground for such legendary black men and women, right? We're going to talk about that. The first thing you got to understand, you have to go back to the French colony, right? The days of the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And the northern section of the colony was the most lucrative part of the colony, right? There were plantations all over the colony, but the northern plantations were some of the most lucrative plantations in all of the Western Hemisphere, them sugar plantations in the north. And because they were so lucrative, you needed a lot of labor, right? You needed a large workforce to make sure that those plantations remained lucrative because they were supplying Europe with all that sugar and coffee. So as you can imagine, the northern plantations had the largest population of enslaved blacks in all of the colony. And that's why it was in the northern plains, the northern plantations. That was where the revolution first kicked off. That was why the northern section became the launch pad for the revolution, because it was those blacks living in the north under the tyranny of the French in the north. They were the ones that had to live daily under the brutality of them sugar plantations. That was why it was them that broke off the chains first and led the rebellion against the European colonists. That was why that famous ceremony that took place at the start of the revolution, it took place in the north. Right. That was why all them legendary events, it took place in the north. Them legendary battles, it all took place in the north. All the military headquarters, Dessalines headquarters, Toussaint Louverture's headquarters, Christophe's headquarters, everybody's headquarters. It was all in the north. That's why the north became the most militarized zone in the entire country, right? That's why the citadel was built in the north. That was where all the cannons and the weapons and the ammunition and the gunpowder was stored in the north, right? I'm not saying that you didn't have this same revolutionary spirit with those in the South, but in the South, you had a different demographic, shift that happened in the South. In the South, you had more of a concentration of the mixed race elites, right? The mixed race generals, they held sway in the South. They're the ones that held power in the South. These were the sons and daughters of the French colonists, right? Guys like Alexander Pétion, guys like General Bourgella, guys like André Rigaud, right? These were men who had white fathers. Some of these men were educated. Some of these men owned land. Some of these men even owned slaves, right? So at the time of the revolution, you had a class of, wealthy, educated, property-owning mulatto elites that were mainly concentrated in the South. Many of them already obtained their freedom long before the revolution. Many of them never were enslaved a day in their life, right? So, and a lot of them identified with the French customs, the French language, the French culture, the French fashion, the French ideals, the French, everything. And many of them fought in the revolution, but not necessarily to abolish slavery, right? But mainly to, entrench their own status and power in the hierarchy of the colony. That's why after independence, the government was essentially split into two governments, with Christophe controlling the north and the mulatto generals controlling the south. Now, when it came to the north, you had a black elite, right? In contrast to the mulatto elites of the south, in the northern section of the country, you had a black elite. Right, because these were the guys who were the descendants of the northern sugar plantations that were the most lucrative in the entire colony, those brutal sugar plantations in the north. And that's why when the French government had sent representatives over to the country in the year 1814, when they went to the South, when they met with the mulatto generals were open to the idea of opening relations with the French. When they went to the North, what happened? You already know. The French ambassador, he got killed, right? Christophe killed him, right? So as you can see, the ideology was very different between the North and the South. Where the South was more open to engaging with the Western powers, the North was more nationalistic, more isolationist, and actually killed the French ambassador when they came to their territory. And essentially, that's why the north of Haiti holds so much cultural significance in the modern day. And you know how the Muslims go to Mecca, right? That's how, you know, us as black folks, man, we got to go to the north of Haiti, man. We got to go to the citadel. We got to go to them historical sites, man, because that's like our Mecca, right? In terms of, you know, black empowerment. And like I said, I'm not minimizing the contribution of those who came from other parts of the country. I'm not doing that. But we just got to, you know, spit the historical reality, man. The north of Haiti produced some of the most legendary individuals in the history of the black race. And that simply has to be acknowledged. So, yeah. Anyways, man, it's your boy Neferkari. That's Dessalines back in the Billy. Yes, indeed. Cash App in the description. Support the channel, man. Support the album. Peace. Album out now, and I'm gone. Peace.
Told me she loved me and said that it's real. So independent, ain't signing no deal. Feel like a king and I'm up at Cap Henry. I'm in the citadel, top of the hill. Trying to run up and we let off a cannon. Secret location, I'm keeping it sealed. You ain't retaliate, Franco Medina. Came to the country and he got killed. You ain't retaliate, Rafi and Mans. Thought you was law, thought you was real. Didn't even want to come pick up the body. Had your man locked up, he died in the cell. Up at the palace, I'm throwing a party. Right on the south and I'm giving them hell. And my little shorty, she looking exotic. African features, she casting a spell. Run to the check like I work on my fitness. Wake up each morning and handle my business. Said that she love me, she want my genetics. Wanna get married and make it official. Wanna get married and have my babies. Up in the city, I'm riding Mercedes. Up in the city, they treat me like royalty. Feeling like Dolph, talking about lords. Spreading my wings and I had to get fly. Up in the top, an incredible vibe. Came from the bottom, I'm up in the sky. Gave one look and said, baby, you fine. Wake up each morning and handle my business. They just be talking, you see me, I live it. Ride on my enemies, sounding like thunder. 1804, got that shit in my spirit. 1804 when I step in the building. 1804, and that's word of my mother. Rock my women and die for my brother. Never gon' fall when I'm deep under pressure. Tell them we back and they better accept it. Move like a king, every step is divine. Ride on my enemies with no exception. Taking revenge and I'm taking what's mine. Pour up a drink and it's time that we toast. Watching my back, keep my enemies close. Only the family, I stick with my brothers. Cannon's position outside of the coast. Heavy artillery for the protection. Move like a general, stick to the code. Feel like a king when I'm up in the north. Beautiful women, they trying to get chose. Launch an invasion all over the south. Capture the capital with all my woes. Look at my energy and my demeanor. Dripping that ice and that's head to my toes. Lately I'm flexing all on the Americans. Flexing my muscle on missing my road. Just got a carriage just coming from London. Boy, that shit cash, I ain't taking no loans. Boy, that shit cash, that's fresh on the boat. Enemy know I got millions in gold. Enemy know I got choppers and cannons. How did I do it? They can't understand it. How did I do it? It's cause I'm relentless. Call me King Harry, my name is cemented. Call me King Harry, I'm up in the palace. Call me King Harry, I'm raising the status.